Great to be back in Tshwane. I've got no problem with the name Tshwane. You know where Tshwane comes from? From Tswanepoels. Johannes Tswanepoel and his wife Indrina Tswanepoel. They originated from Tshwane. That's where Tshwane comes from. Now, welcome, ladies and gents, to Standard Bank's Agri-Business Conference. And to all our guests and clients, we really hope and trust that you will enjoy this day. And as you might have experienced, this is always an interactive session with a difference. And also to all our people from outside, Gauteng, you're more than welcome. Dumelang Bontati Libume, Gotsong Kaufela. Any Afrikaans-speaking people here? Toughies. Nee, julle is baie welkom hoor, dit is fantasties om julle hier so te hê. Ek moet sê ek het so klein bietjie verdwaal and the traffic so hectic. I was driving here en hier aan die kant by 'n garage, toe ek nou heeltemal ek weet toe glad nie meer om hier te kom nie. Ek sê vir 'n ou daar by die petroljoggie, ek stap na hom toe, ek sê jy moet my nou help, wat is die vinnigste om nou by hierdie Royal Elephant Hotel uit te kom? Hy sê stap jy of ry jy? Ek sê nee, ek ry. Hy sê daai is die vinnigste. So yes. Yeah. Who attended last year? Can I have an indication? Who attended last year? The hands right? Yeah, there's a lot of you. Thank you. You are more than welcome as well. The house rules. No smoking inside. As jy regtig warm word, kan jy buite op die snelweg gaan rook en dan no cell phones, please. No cell phones. There will be time limits for our speakers and they know. And please apply to that. And also the media. Thank you very much for being here today. It's always nice to see you. Talked about the traffic this morning. It's really hectic. I mean, I'm from a subtropical town called Potchefstroom, so we don't have that traffic in the morning. It takes you about 7 minutes to drive about 10 k's. So what happened this morning was, I mean, half an hour, 2 hours. I just heard people said outside they've been on the roads on the highways since this morning, 6 o'clock. But very interesting, I saw a bakkie inside, just in front of me this morning with a sticker. And, you know, I tried to read what's on the sticker, and there was this phrase, please pray for our President, Jacob Zuma. And I thought, yes. And the next line is, please pray for the EFF leader, Mr. Julius Malema. And I thought, yes, and I want to see the last one, and please pray for our neighbors, President Robert Mugabe. Just underneath that, and go and read Psalm 109, verse 8. And I couldn't drive fast enough just to come here and read in the Bible. You know what is in Psalm 108, verse 9? Let his life be short and let someone else take his place. Isn't the Bible a wonderful book? Isn't it? It's fantastic. So thanks to that farmer, he made my day. Yeah. Ladies and gents, we have a questionnaire form. So please, during the course of the day and the morning, just fill in questions for our panel. You will find the panel discussion very, very interesting. And it's very professional as well. And it's great to be with the guys from the panel, so all the panelists. Just write down your name and a question, and they will collect it at your table. And just after tea, when we start with our panel discussion, we can use those questions. Now, our first speaker this morning is, and I'd like to welcome him, is Brad Breedske. Now, Brad obtained economics, law, and tax qualifications from UCT and WITS. Then he started his career in the mining industry and working for Goldfields and also Anglo American. And thereafter, he joined Standard Bank in 2001 as their project finance team. During his career in the bank, he's been the head of mining, energy, and infrastructure finance, the head of project finance, and also the head of debt products in investment banking. In this time, he's been involved in many of the major financing initiatives in these areas, both in South Africa as well as in the bank's other African franchises. And he joined the commercial banking team in 2015 as head of the core sector teams. In his spare time, he has fallen off many mountain bikes, broken a number of racing canoes, and he's the father of 2 teenage children who keep him on his toes. And he's also a very keen golf player. He is to golf as Bakkies Botha is to gymnastics. Let's give him a big hand of applause. Brad Breedske, you're more than welcome. Thanks.
Morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, always difficult to talk after Peter when he's whipped the crowd up into a bit of a frenzy. See if this thing works. Right. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all here this morning. Oh, yeah, and also those of you that were here last year, I'm going to find you over tea time to see whether Peter's jokes from last year have changed to this year, because we've had the pleasure of being with him through the course of the whole of the last week. And I must say that delivery is excellent, the way it changes every time. And thanks for that, Peter. We really appreciate the time that you've taken out of your diaries and busy schedules to spend with us today. And we're hopeful that you find the program to be informative, useful, and that will provide you with some good insights into the sector and your businesses. In addition, we hope that the day will provide you with an opportunity to spend some time interacting with some key colleagues and role players in the sector. As Peter said, my name is Brad. I'm responsible for the core sectors and new business acquisition in commercial banking for Standard Bank. And at the outset, may I stress that agriculture is for us indeed a core and critical sector. Standard Bank's origins more than 150 years ago were born in the agri sector, and we believe firmly that our role in it going forward is as important, if not more so than ever. Now, there's always a little bit of anxiety at an agri function when the audience hears somebody speaking English about the topic, but please do not stress too much. The bank hasn't gone completely mad and let an English-speaking city dweller loose on the sector. My function as a career banker is to ensure that the key insights and sector specialization, which we believe we have carefully built up in our team, are translated into effective, customer-focused, relevant, and modern offerings to our client base. We've still got a lot to do to achieve this, but we are committed to understanding what matters to you, our clients, who are our reason for existence, and to deliver thereon. Now, our industry is changing rapidly, as is yours. The tsunami of regulation, which we have had to contend with as a result of the financial crisis, fundamentally affects the ways in which we interact with our clients. In addition, as Nico will show later, there's been a very substantial increase in the overall levels of leverage in the agri sector. Banks need to become more sophisticated in the types of financing structures they employ to deal with this, to facilitate the efficient syndication and distribution of risk, and to develop ways of attracting other investors looking for exposure to agri as an asset class. In this regard, we've seen a noticeable increase in the levels of interest from private equity firms and offshore investors into the sector, and we need to capitalize on this. All of us here today are joined one way or another in the common purpose of producing foods to feed people, and this endeavor is going to pose significant challenges and opportunities going forward, which we'll touch on today. The world will add close to 1.5 billion extra people to its population by 2030, most of whom will come from developing countries. Closer to home, by the end of this century, nearly 40% of this growth will originate from Africa. The agricultural industry and investment therein must position itself accordingly to respond to this. It's likely that meeting this demand will require significant disruption of current ways of doing things. Today, some of the key themes we would like to focus on are the principles underpinning sustainable wealth creation in agribusiness, to reaffirm our belief that agriculture is a key foundation of economic growth. Then a little bit of a cheeky topic, which Nico will ably deal with, is to debate whether banks are your friend or foe in the growth of your business. If you want to join us for lunch afterwards, please reserve all of your candid thoughts on this matter till afterwards, when lunch and drinks have been served. Finally, we'd like to consider the bank's role in the growth and preservation of wealth that is generated in your business. The mega trends which are emerging will be considered, as will be the need to balance social imperatives, particularly in developing countries. The investment requirements to ensure the sector's success are enormous, and we need to examine ways in which such investment can be attracted and how appropriate returns are generated. Perhaps to frame the discussions, it would be useful to provide a snapshot of the bank's house view on the macro indicators which shape some of our thinking, and about the economy going forward. But a very big disclaimer is required here, as we do not have the benefit of our group economics team to unpack these forecasts. However, knowing for sure that these estimates will undoubtedly be wrong, which is the job of economists, the following key forecasts are highlighted. We estimate inflation will increase throughout 2016 and peak at 7% before moderating next year, while interest rates will rise by a further 50 basis points during the course of the year. You know the MPC is sitting during the course of this week. Our house call is for a 25 basis points increase. And thereafter, we forecast it will level off in 2017. The rand is going to drift slowly this year. We estimate to close at just over 16 for the year, but perhaps optimistically, we think it will revert to a more fundamental level of 15 in the year following. We think that the oil price will gradually increase during 2017, reflecting a slow but gradual improvement in global GDP. Clearly, there are a number of factors which can influence these projections, but as indicated, and for what it's worth, they perhaps form a basis on which to inform the broad discussions here today. We are mindful of the risks as well as the opportunities in the sector. The current drought, policy uncertainty, and overall state of our economy pose great challenges. We've seen the South African agri-industry contract for the last 3 quarters. However, we must remember the cyclical nature of the business and take a long-term view on it. It's important for us in the banking world to try to avoid the tendency to act in a pro-cyclical manner. By this I mean being too loose in the good times and too conservative in times where inevitably in a cyclical sector the going gets a bit tougher. Now, while these behaviors from the financial sector are perhaps understandable, we believe they are best countered by deep sector insights and commitments to that sector. I hope that you'll find time to interact with our team, who I believe have these capabilities and are truly committed to the agribusiness. Please enjoy the day, and may I take an early opportunity to thank you for being our clients. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad, and thanks for being part of the organizing committee, and to Nico and his team. Let's give them a big hand of applause. Always nice to be here. Thank you very much. Ek het so ietsie in my keel. Ek weet nie of julle kan julle my duidelik hoor daar agter. Ek het my dokter vanoggend gebel te sê ek het so 'n bietjie iets in die keel en ek moet met 'n paar boere en mense in die agri-sektor gaan praat. Wat gaan help? Toe sê hy gemmerbrandewyn, maar ek hoor toe emmerbrandewyn. Wie hoe gesyp was ek hierso by Kalulies? Sal nie glo nie, maar ek het nou weer reg gekom. Yeah, ladies and gents, it's a historical day also for us because there's 2 guys all the way from Western Australia and also the county Queensland, Surfers Paradise, Norman and Gareth. Let's give them a big welcome. Thanks to you 2 guys. They're visiting the National Wool Growers Association in Port Elizabeth, and one of the bank managers there invited them here. Just for the sake of the 2 Afrikaans guys, daar's 2 ouens van Australië wat nou hier so saam met ons is. I'm just telling them where you come from. Ek wil maar net sê, soos julle self weet, julle weet mos wat maak die Australiërs om veilige seks toe te pas. Hulle merkie skape wat byt. Now, I was just telling you, more than welcome here. What a privilege to have 2 Australian guys here this morning. Ladies and gents, our next speaker will be Guy Lundy. Now, Guy is a partner at the investment consulting firm Odgers Brenston, strategy consultant, and also a very sought-after professional keynote speaker with a focus on the future of Africa and also the business opportunities presented by the continent's dramatic growth story. He's also the director of several organizations, such as Cape Town Tourism, and he previously ran his own corporate strategy consultancy, helping large companies develop foresight and also an understanding of future trends. And lastly, he's also the author of 2 books about South Africa and its future. One was translated into Afrikaans recently, called Die Prag en Praal en Sukses van Nkandla en 101 ander liegstories. No, it's not true. It's such a privilege. I had supper with him last night, and what a great guy. Let's give him a big hand of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. It's always good, you know, you do these road shows and you move around from place to place and you get to know the guys that you're working with. And Peter has actually learned how to pronounce my name correctly now, which is very encouraging because most people in this country pronounce it Lundi, which of course for some of the population means they expect a black guy to come up onto stage. But either way, it's pronounced Guy Lundy. And one of the, probably I'd call it amusing, although it was a little bit offensive to me at the time, occasions where my name was most incorrectly pronounced, is that one of the pizza delivery companies couldn't find me on their system when I phoned in. And eventually when the slip came after we'd worked it all out, I realized why, and they had me on their system as Gay Looney, which I'm not, by the way. Neither of those things. What I am and trained as is that I'm trained as a futurist. So a futurist is somebody who is essentially a well-qualified fortune teller. It's somebody who has gone to the Stellenbosch Business School and studied for a couple of years on how to forecast trends going into the future. So studying what's happening today in order to try to understand what might happen tomorrow. And so what I'm going to talk you through today is some of the major trends, some of what we call the mega trends that are taking place globally, continentally, and locally in South Africa, so that we can get an idea of what might happen in your sector and what's likely to happen around the world that will have an impact on your lives. So let's kick off with that. But I want to start out by pointing something out that we in South Africa tend to do quite a lot of. We focus very much on events as opposed to broader trends. And if you look at this, this is the Business Confidence Index since 1975. So 40 years worth of Business Confidence Index. And when you look at that, you can tell that South Africans are extremely schizophrenic. So we get very affected by events, and it either makes us incredibly sad and depressed and the future is all a total disaster, or we have events that make us feel that actually it's all fantastic and we're going to take on the world and we're the best country on earth. Now, General Jan Smuts once made a comment, which has been quoted subsequently, that South Africa is a country where the best and the worst never happen. So he was kind of pointing out that we tend to expect the best or the worst to happen all the time, but actually we kind of muddle along and we do our thing. And we should really stop being so impacted by things like in 1980 when the gold price went up to $800 an ounce and we thought, you know, the future is now ours for the taking. And then in 1984 there was the Rubicon speech by P.W. Botha, and of course then there were the financial sanctions, and it's all downhill from there. And then 1990, Nelson Mandela is released. And then a very interesting one in 1995, if you can see that little peak over there, up in 1995. That was when we won the Rugby World Cup. So even events like winning the Rugby World Cup makes us feel like, you know, it's all happy again. But then, of course, in 1997, 98, we had 25% interest rates. So the world was a disaster once more. So we tend to focus on events rather than longer-term trends. And I'd really love to see South Africans being more focused on longer-term trends than we've traditionally tended to be. If you look at it since 2008, of course, we've been dragging along, not quite sure whether we're happy or sad, happy, sad, virtually every other month. And that's largely because we're sitting in a very, very difficult space in global history. And so I want to move on to that now and look at another theory which really takes into account much more of this idea of longer-term trends. These are known as long waves. They are very neat because I drew them. It's not because history does actually do exactly this, but this is really to give you an idea of what the theory of long waves is. It was a theory that was developed by a Soviet economist called Kondratiev back in the 1930s. And Kondratiev was tasked by Stalin at the time of the Great Depression and the enormous crash in 1929 to prove that capitalism was dead. Unfortunately for Kondratiev, his studies went away, and he found his results were that actually capitalism was not dead, which meant that shortly thereafter Kondratiev was dead. That was the prize for giving Stalin the wrong answer. But what he had found was that there'd, at that stage, been three major waves in history since the Industrial Revolution of the 1700s, driven largely by three major technologies: steam power back in the early 1800s, railways in the later 1800s, and then electricity and motor vehicles in the early 1900s. And those technologies had driven a massive period of growth. The world had gone through enormous periods of growth, which had then ended up in what he termed a peak war. Back in 1812, the war against Napoleon, the US Civil War in the 1860s, World War I in 1914 to 1918, which caused a dip and a bit of a drop. If you think back to the late 1910s, early 1920s, you had hyperinflation in Europe. It was a very unpleasant place to be shortly after the First World War. But then, of course, you had the roaring 20s, and it picked up again. And so after that dip, it picks up again, and then it leads into a massive crash, 1929, and so on. Subsequent to him coming up with his theories, there's been a fourth wave, which started after the Second World War. And that was driven largely by the development of computers and information technology, which was essentially driven by the Cold War and the desire by the superpowers to get to the moon first. So in order to try to get to the moon, there were huge government contracts on both sides of the ocean to try and drive the development of information technology that would get man onto the moon. So we saw Hewlett-Packard and Intel and Apple and Microsoft and all of these companies coming up through the 50s, 60s, 70s. Particularly in the 50s and 60s, we saw a huge period of growth post the Second World War, which then, of course, ended in the peak war of the Vietnam War, and then in 1973, we had the oil crisis. You'll remember the days when 6 o'clock in the afternoon, the garages would close, they wouldn't be open for the weekend, et cetera, et cetera. So tough times back in the 1970s, and then, of course, Reaganomics and Margaret Thatcher and so on picked it up again in the 80s, into the 90s and early 2000s, followed by 2008 and the major crash. So where we sit today, if you believe in these long waves, is we sit at the bottom of a wave. And that's why, if you look back at that business confidence index, we're dragging along like that, because it's a very unpleasant place to be. Let's be clear. I mean, nobody really wants to sit at the bottom of a wave. I mean, I'm a surfer, and when I'm at the bottom of a wave after it's just broken on me, it's a pretty unpleasant experience. But it's normal. It's something that the world has gone through before, and it'll go through it again. But it also means that we are at the beginning of the next wave. So the big question, of course, is what is the technology that's going to drive the growth through that next wave, through the fifth wave? And I think that it's a combination of three major technologies. First one is biotechnology, which is essentially the development of science around DNA, around molecules, around living beings, etc. That picture up there of the sheep is Dolly the sheep. Dolly was cloned back in the 1990s. That's 20 years worth of cloning technology that has subsequently been developed based on the beginnings of Dolly the sheep. And I pretty firmly believe that we're very close to the point where we would be able to, whether we would actually do it or not, but we'd be able to clone a human being. If we could clone a sheep 20 years ago, I'm pretty certain that we're somewhere near being able to clone a human being today, or at least within the next 10 years. So the work that's going on around biotechnology is going to have an impact on your industry. It already has with the GM crops that are out there all over the place. I'm sure that some of you, at least here, are using GM crops. We have quite a high percentage of GM crops here in South Africa. And it will make farming and agriculture more efficient, the use and continued spread of biotechnology. The second point is nanotechnology, which is the science of the very, very small. So you can put chips into animals, and you can find exactly where they are at any given moment. The Swiss and their cowbells are going to end up with a problem, those makers of cowbells. But nanotechnology is applicable to a whole range of things, particularly in health, in animal health, in human health, etc. Just one example of a form of nanotechnology is a thing called a nanobot, which is in the process of being developed or has been developed, but is in the process of being able to be applied. It's a molecule-sized, the size of a blood molecule, little machine that produces oxygen. It can be injected into the bloodstream, and it can produce oxygen within the body without you actually having to breathe. It has all sorts of fairly useless uses, like if you want to get away from the family, you can sit at the bottom of the pool for a couple of hours without having to worry about breathing. But of course, it also helps with things like a heart attack. So if you have a heart attack and fall over and you have one of these things in your body, it's more likely that you will survive the heart attack than if you don't. So another technology that's driving the growth, the wave of growth. And then the third of these, which pulls them together, is the growth and spread of artificial intelligence. Now, in your industry, artificial intelligence is already being used on a range of different fields. So, for example, driverless cars, driverless vehicles. There are farms, there may even be some in this country that are using driverless vehicles to plow fields. So you have GPS-enabled technology that's pulling in data and that's then taking a tractor and it's driving it by itself. You don't need a human intervention to be able to move that vehicle up and down. There is something that I do know is in use in this country is that some of the quarries are using driverless vehicles to drive their trucks out of the bottom of the pit. It's actually safer than having a human driver because the vehicle knows exactly where it needs to go. It's being GPS controlled, and so it gets out more safely than if you have a human driver that gets bored before he gets to the top. So all of this pulling together is really what is likely to drive the next wave of growth in the global economy. Very interesting and really worth looking at in terms of how do these things apply to your business, your industry, on an ongoing basis. If you're not looking at how these apply to you, you're going to get left behind in one way or another. Of course, where we sit at the moment is a relatively uncomfortable place in the world. So let's have a look at some of the things that are taking place in the world, starting off with the starting point of the fact that we are in a place of financial uncertainty. And I firmly believe that that financial uncertainty is going to be with us for a couple more years. We've already had it for 8 years. Remember that the crash was in 2008, we're now in 2016, and it's very likely that we're going to experience some financial uncertainty and discomfort for the next 2 or 3 years. Luckily, here in South Africa, we sit in a relatively strong position, particularly in terms of the safety of our financial system, especially our banks. So if you look at this chart, which shows from the World Economic Forum the list of the world's safest banks, you can see that they rank South Africa as having the 8th safest banks in the world. It certainly sits higher than Switzerland, that nation of bankers, who sit 20th in the world. And then, of course, our competitors amongst the BRICS, Brazil, Russia at 115, India at 100, China at 78, in terms of the safety of their banks and the safety of, as an extension, their financial system. And, of course, our major customers, the United States, France, Germany, United Kingdom, etc. So it has helped to shield us to some degree from the financial uncertainty and instability around the world, and I think that it will continue to enable us to operate in the next few years of continued financial uncertainty. Of course, when you have financial uncertainty, it has a couple of impacts on a social level which are worth noting, because we're experiencing them at the moment. They feel uncomfortable, but it is important to realize that when you have a financial crisis, these things are normal. So in times of crisis, there are a couple of social changes that take place. The first one is that there's an increase in conservatism. And this impacts on things like dress length. So women, when times are good, they wear shorter and shorter dresses and skirts. It's just a global fact. There is, in fact, an economist who watches skirt length in order to try to understand what's likely to happen with the economy. You have things like beards, for example. So beards have become, amongst the youth, amongst students and amongst rugby players and so on, these big beards have become something of a fashion icon. I tend to think that those big beards that the rugby players go onto the field with are likely to go the way of the mullet in about the next 5 to 10 years. But the last time that we saw excessive facial hair as a fashion statement was the 1970s. The last time we felt particularly uncomfortable economically. But this conservatism also extends into politics. So we have Donald Trump in the United States. We have Le Pen in France. We have all of these conservative political leaders that are gaining traction around the world because people are willing to give up what they saw as an important thing around freedom and freedom of movement, freedom of thoughts, freedom of speech, etc., to go with somebody more hardline, more conservative when times are tough. So what we see here in South Africa with Julius Malema, who is fundamentally very conservative, it's a normal move towards something like that where people feel financial instability and the effects of financial crisis. The second point is that governments, in trying to deal with this, the only thing that they can really do is change policy. So as a result, we have what Brad spoke about earlier, which is this raft of regulation that we end up getting faced with. And I was telling the story the other day that I'm in the process of trying to open a bank account for my family trust, which is very easy to say. It sort of rolls off the tongue. But trying to open a bank account for a family trust these days in the regulatory environment that we have is extremely difficult. I don't blame the bank, but it's just one of the things that governments around the world do is shove red tape into the system because they think that it's the only thing that they can do in order to try to control the instability, try to calm things down. I tend to think that it actually makes things more difficult, but it's what governments do at times like this. And then the third thing that happens is social unrest and independence movements. So we've seen social unrest, and we continue to see social unrest taking place around the world. We saw last year in Hong Kong, in Brazil, in Turkey, and so many other places. And of course, right now, we're seeing it at Donald Trump rallies in the United States, where people are attacking each other, and it's becoming particularly unpleasant. So this social unrest that we see here in South Africa is mirrored all over the world, and it's something that is just simply not unusual in times of economic crisis. It goes hand in hand with independence movements, where back in the 1970s, you'll remember that Quebec wanted to break away from Canada, and the Basque countries wanted to break away from Spain, etc. Today, we see Scotland wanting to break away from the United Kingdom. So an interesting coincidence that it happens to coincide with the fact that the world is in a very difficult financial space. So, as I've said, it's normal, it doesn't feel comfortable, it doesn't feel right, but it's not unusual considering where we are in the position of the long waves that we have experienced throughout history. A couple of other things that are taking place around the world at the moment as a result of this financial crisis. One of them is ongoing consolidation. So we are seeing, and we have seen, significant consolidation of major companies. That one in the top left corner there, that's AB InBev and SAB Miller, $100 billion gathering of two companies. What it means is that when those two companies become one, and I say when because I think it's pretty much a done deal, it means that of every 3 beers made in the world, 1 will come from AB InBev, SAB Miller. So 1 in every 3 beers will be made by the same company in the world, which is quite a frightening number, especially if you don't like the beers they make. But you've got others directly in your industry that are coming together at the moment. DuPont and Dow, 2 chemical companies. ChemChina and Syngenta, another 2 chemical companies who have an impact on the fertilizer industry, on the seed industry, a whole range of other industries that are direct inputs into your industry. In technology companies, in pharmaceutical companies, there's been a whole range of giants that have come together into multi-billion-dollar mergers. What it probably means is that in the next 10 to 15 years, we can expect to see a small number of very large companies and a large number of very small companies. The little guys, the sort of mid-level guys, are likely to increasingly disappear. And they're going to be joining and becoming bigger, or the guys that are cut out of that process are going to go off and they're going to start their own show. So it's going to become a world of 2 quite big extremes in terms of the sizes of the companies that you're having to deal with. At the same time as this is happening, we've got a process of economic shift that's taking place, and I'm sure most of you are aware of what's happening here, and that is a shift from the north and the west to the south and the east. And if you look at this map over here, it's showing where the major growth is in the world. It's taking place in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and the rest of Asia Pacific, those dark green colors. In the north, Europe, Russia, etc., that's where the lowest growth is currently, and to the northwest, the United States, they're starting to pick themselves up, but still significantly lower growth than we're experiencing in the south and the east. And as the south and the east becomes more and more economically powerful, it's also going to become more and more politically powerful. So you're seeing China flexing its muscles. The Chinese are out there building islands in the middle of the South China Sea, whether the Filipinos and the Vietnamese like it or not. They've in fact got a naval base sitting in the Seychelles right now, because the Chinese, obviously, they wanted access into the area that was being affected by Somali pirates. They've been very effective at blowing those guys out of the water. We haven't heard much about pirates for a while. But of course, it now means that they've got a foothold, a naval foothold into Africa. And so the Chinese, the Indians, and various others in the south and the east are going to become more politically active on a global scale. The positive for us here in South Africa is that we have access into that African market, probably better than anybody else into the rest of Africa. And that's where a significant amount of growth is coming from. We need to take advantage of it as much as we possibly can. So while this shift is taking place, another shift that's also happening is a demographic shift. Brad spoke a little bit about the population growth that's taking place, and it's expected by, this is a chart that shows numbers coming out of the United Nations. It's expected by the United Nations that by 2050, we will go from around 7 billion people today to around 9.5 billion people in the next 35 years. That's another 2 billion people that are going to be added to the world's population, 1 billion of which are going to be coming out of Africa. So Africa today sits at around 1 billion. We will have 2 billion by 2050. And so another billion coming out of Africa and the remaining billion coming out of other emerging markets around the world. So a significant growth in population. But more important than that is the significant growth in urbanization of that population. In 2010, we became 50% urbanized for the first time in human history. So more than half of the world's population, with its incredible size already, now lives in cities and towns, not in the rural areas of the world anymore. And that process is just continuing and continuing to the point where by 2050, 70% of the world's population will live in cities and towns. That means that you're going to have a lot more cities the size of Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, etc., around the world. And in Africa, we're going to see the same thing with Lagos, Kinshasa, Nairobi. These cities are likely to grow to 20, 25, even 30 million people in the next 30 to 35 years. That's a good and a bad thing. On the good side, it means that the populations are a lot more concentrated, so you can serve them a lot more easily because you can distribute to them. If you were a cell phone company, for example, you'd be able to put one mast that could serve a massive number of people as opposed to the mast out in the middle of nowhere that serves about 15. So from a business perspective, it helps to have people concentrated in one place. But from a management perspective, it's very difficult to manage those sorts of numbers. And part of the problem is that cities and towns are built on what was arable land. They started as villages because they were next to a fresh water source, a river, or a dam or something like that. And of course, they were close to where they could grow food. And those villages then became towns, became cities, and now are megacities. So that 70% of the world's population are not growing food, and they're living in areas where they used to grow food. So it means that your industry is going to become significantly more important over the next 35 years than it is already. And it is going to require the 30% of you that are still growing food to be a whole lot more efficient than you've ever been before. Hence, those technologies that I spoke about earlier becoming that much more important to you so that you can improve your efficiency. I talked about the cities that are going to struggle in terms of managing their numbers. These are pictures taken from West Africa and from South Africa on the right there. And you can see how difficult it is for these cities already to try to manage this urban explosion. Going forward, they're going to have even more of a challenge. And as a result, it's going to become increasingly uncomfortable in those cities. So what you can expect is a lot more people in this country from elsewhere in the world as they look for places that are more comfortable to be. Talking about Africa, this chart here comes from UNICEF, and it shows their anticipation of what African countries' populations are likely to do. And you can see how many countries there are that are going to more than double their population between now and 2050. Nigeria, for example, expected to go from around 180 million today to just short of 450 million by 2050. The DRC, more than doubling its population. Ethiopia, more than doubling. Tanzania, a lot more than doubling. Kenya, doubling. Uganda, a lot more than doubling. Mozambique, Madagascar, Cameroon. All of these populations in the next 35 years will more than double. One anomaly you'll notice, of course, is South Africa, where South Africa is expected not to grow that much. And the major reason why South Africa's population is expected not to grow that much is that orange line over there. So you can see that between now and 2030, we're expected to be on more or less the same population that we're on today because our population growth rate is in the process of collapsing. And the major driver of that population growth rate drop is urbanization. We already sit at over 60% urbanized as a nation, which is highly unusual for an emerging market, by the way. And that urbanization has taken place between 1990 and today. Huge growth of the cities. We've seen it, Diepsloot and all sorts of other places, as people have moved from the rural areas where they were forcibly made to stay, and they've now moved into the cities, and that process is largely done. Now that they're in the cities, they're having fewer children. So, they do things at night like watch TV, go out to nightclubs, stuff like that, as opposed to, what they do when there's no electricity and TV. So they have 2 children as opposed to 7 or 8. And so as a result, our population growth rate is dipping dramatically, and we can expect a more or less stable population, which is a good thing for us. Because as long as we continue to experience some economic growth, we can actually uplift the majority of the people who are living in dire straits at the moment. Because we can use that money without having to worry about the numbers just growing and growing and growing. Of course, the wild card in all of this is the people from north of us who are seeing this paradise-type situation by comparison, who are looking for opportunity by moving down into South Africa. On the other hand, in many other parts of the world, in the developing nations, you've got an aging population, particularly in Europe and most especially in Japan. So a lot of the technology that's coming out of that healthcare drive for the older people as the population becomes older is starting to have an impact on us. So for example, the monitoring of health. I'm sure there's somebody here, at least one person that has an Apple Watch, so you can watch your blood pressure and your heart rate and everything else at any given minute of the day. It seems a little obsessive, but at the same time, what it does do is that it enables you to monitor your own health and go and see a doctor if necessary when you need to. And long before we would have done it 10, 20 years ago, and so as a result, people can remain healthier and live longer. And of course, as they live longer, they need more help. So there's a whole explosion going on in robotics, particularly out of Japan, where they don't have cheap labor to help them get out of bed and walk across the street and go shopping, etc. So robots are increasingly being used to do that work for the aged. And the technology that's going into those robots is being pulled out and used in other applications like vehicles, etc. So for example, that bottom right picture is paraplegic people who have lost the power of their legs, who are now able to walk again by strapping on an exoskeleton which enables them to walk. So interesting technology and technological opportunities coming out of that. While all of this is happening, something that's very directly applicable to your industry is that the world is going to become hungrier and thirstier. With the weather patterns changing, with climate change, which seems to be undisputed these days, it is likely that the world is going to get wetter in certain parts, drier in other parts, and generally hotter in most parts around the globe. So what it means is that the focus on carbon-emitting economies is going to become more and more intense. And unfortunately for us here in South Africa, because we produce such a high percentage of our energy through coal-burning power stations, it means that we are a very, very high emitter of carbon per $1,000 of GDP that we produce. So it's become imperative that if people are going to continue buying our product, then they need to know that the energy that was used to produce it, to pump the water and to keep the cold rooms cold, etc., was done using clean energy. So what you will see more and more of, and what I would encourage you to consider using more and more of, is the types of renewable energy projects that are going out there at the moment in a massive rollout in South Africa. We've done a classic South African thing. We've thought about renewable energy for an incredibly long time. We've made sure that we've got every T crossed and I dotted, and now we've on a very significant renewable energy rollout that is recognized around the world as one of the most significant renewable energy rollouts that's taking place globally at the moment. So you can see the windmills that are going up, you can see the solar farms happening up in the Northern Cape, and of course on buildings all over the place you're starting to see solar panels as they've become cheaper, more available, and people have wanted to use them more. Another thing that you can expect to happen, it's happening already in particularly the US and Europe, and it's going to impact us here, is a focus on food waste and water waste. So if you aren't looking at how do you reduce the waste of food and the waste of water in your daily operations, you need to start thinking about it, because it's going to be added to that list of checkpoints around how green is your energy, how much food do you waste, how much water do you waste. So a big focus that will continue to happen over the next 5-10 years. And then finally, on a global level, is this last point, which is the growing irrelevance of location. Location is going to become less and less of a factor as we move into the next 10, 20 years. And there are a couple of technologies that are driving this. That top left picture up over there is Elon Musk, the South African who grew up here in Pretoria, who has developed companies like Tesla and SpaceX and various others. And he's come up with a technology that is very seriously being pursued at the moment, which is a train that runs in a vacuum tube. So you'll remember in the olden days of retail, you used to go to the shop, the guy would write out a slip, he'd stick it in a little capsule, and it would get sucked by a vacuum to the cashier upstairs. He would then give you your change, and it would come whoop back down again. This thing works on exactly the same principle. So the big tube, they suck all the air out of it. You drive onto the train in San Francisco, they close it, and it heads to Los Angeles at 800 kilometers per hour. You can go from San Francisco to Los Angeles in half an hour, and you drive out the other side, and you can do a daily commute from San Francisco to Los Angeles. So the application of that sort of technology is making it increasingly unnecessary to decide exactly where you need to live, and where you need to work. At the same time, air travel is being transformed by the work that's going into new airplanes that use significantly less fuel. That one on the bottom left is the Boeing 777X, which is got a very different wing formation. It looks more like a glider than the traditional airplanes, and it uses significantly less fuel. So the cost and the efficiency of flying is going to become a lot more affordable. Top right corner, we've got 3D printing. There's a whole story that can go into 3D printing, but it's still at a relatively early stage. But the printing of items is increasing globally. So it's having an impact on things like if a tractor breaks down and you need to replace a part, rather than having to import it from Korea and waiting 3 weeks or 4 weeks, you can have a 3D printer in a central location in Pretoria that can actually print that part for you, rather than having to import it and ship it across the sea, etc. So 3D printing is definitely going to change industries on a number of levels in terms of being able to print parts on demand, on location, rather than having to bring them from afar. And then the bottom one is a technology that exists and is being used particularly in the US, where there's a lot of telecommuting. This is a little robot that has a screen and a camera and speakers on it, and you can sit at your desk in Johannesburg, and you can attend a meeting in Silicon Valley with a mouse, driving your little robot around the office. You go and you sit next to your colleague. Your colleague can see you, you can see them, you have a conversation. You discuss what needs to be discussed, and then you say, see you later, I'm off to the board meeting, and you drive down the passage, you sit in the board meeting, and you participate. This is a technology that is in use right now. So increasingly, location, where we're based, where we have to live and work, is going to become less and less of a factor. So those are some of the things affecting us on a global level. Let's have a look at Africa. So I talked about that area north of us where we saw the dark green, the growth, the economic growth that's taking place. We've got to take advantage of this. So let's try and understand a little bit more about what's happening in Africa at the moment. The first point is that African growth is being driven largely, or has been driven largely by the untapped resources that are sitting on the continent. Not only mining and metals, but also, of course, arable land. Something like 60-65% of the world's unutilized arable land sits in the continent of Africa. So there are untapped resources that previously we haven't been able to get to because there have been civil wars and there's been destruction of infrastructure that has stopped us from doing that. That is changing rapidly. And one of the other things that's helping that is that there are more and more successful countries in Africa. And this is not an event. The fact that we now have more successful countries doesn't mean it's going to be over next week and then the following week they're all going to be terrible and they're going to be like they were back in the 50s and 60s. It's a process that's taken place over the last 20 years. So if we look at it, what happened in 1990, where we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism, it led to the end of the Cold War. And a lot of Africa's disaster was driven by the Cold War, because it was essentially a series, these civil wars were essentially a series of proxy wars that the superpowers were fighting in various parts of the world, South America, Africa, Asia, so that they could have this ideological warfare and somebody needed to win. And of course, capitalism won, Soviet Union collapsed, and so the money that flowed into these proxy wars just dried up. It really just stopped coming. And so the civil wars ended. You'll remember in Angola when UNITA suddenly disappeared, they were no longer a factor. And as these civil wars ended, democracy was able to start taking root. So we've seen places like Kenya, Zambia, Nigeria, that are increasingly having peaceful and just and fair democratic elections, with a change of leadership within those countries at the ballot box rather than at the end of a gun. So democracy is definitely taking root and has been over the last 20 years. And as that started happening, the IMF, the World Bank, etc., back in the 1990s, applied debt relief to the countries that were highly indebted. But of course, they didn't just give them the debt relief. They said if you're going to have the debt relief, then you need to put in place lower inflation, low debt rates, etc. So it created a much more sound macroeconomic environment, which improved the business environment and which led to a significant growth in foreign investment into the continent. So what we've seen is a steady growth of foreign financial flows into Africa over the last 15, 20 years. And it's really picked up in the last 5 years or so. So real change and real movement and momentum, which I'd like to call the growth continuum that has been happening and continues to happen in Africa. So it started where people were after the resources. They were looking for the resources, they wanted to get at them, but they needed the infrastructure in order to get the stuff out of the ground and to the ports, which were all broken and falling apart, on the roads that were filled with potholes, etc. So huge amounts of money have gone into improving the infrastructure. Foreign companies coming in, rebuilding roads, rebuilding railways, etc. And as that money's come in, it's been used by the people working on those projects to spend on consumer goods, to spend on housing and education for their children, to spend on financial services like banking, insurance, and various others, and of course, increasingly to invest in manufacturing. So we're seeing places like Nigeria, Tanzania, Madagascar, Mozambique, Kenya, that are increasingly becoming a manufacturing hub for lower-end products, which are being taken out of China because it's now starting to become too expensive to produce them there. So particularly in clothing and textiles on the East African side, we're seeing tremendous amounts of activity in the manufacturing space. And so as a result, it's a continuum that just keeps going, the money keeps circulating and keeps becoming more and more. So it's really a process rather than an event. So what's happened is that there's this African consumer that's increasingly been out there spending money. And this is a picture that I took at ShopRite in Lusaka. I took this picture for two reasons. One was to remind me never to go shopping at ShopRite in Lusaka on a Friday afternoon again, because it took about an hour to get through the checkout point with that many people buying goods. But it also showed me the incredible change in a place like Zambia, a country that 15 years ago had no formal retail, that is now being served by ShopRite and any number of other retailers in a very organized retail manner. And these people have got the money and they're spending the money. They're buying the products that you guys are exporting into those countries. The other thing that's happening is that money is being spent on telecommunications and media. So you've got a tremendous amount of cell phone growth, you've got a tremendous amount of internet growth, and a lot of it's coming from this growth in the number of cables that are serving the continent of Africa. If you look along the east and the west coast, you can see those thin black lines. Those were the only subsea cables that existed in 2001. You can see the thinness of the line shows the amount of bandwidth in that cable, and of course it was only one line. So if the line went down, we were all in trouble. Today, and going forward towards 2018, you can see the thickness of the bandwidth that's being put in the undersea cables, and you can see how many cables are now serving the continent of Africa. So as a result, Africans, particularly in those areas that are served directly by those cables, are becoming more and more active online. So this is a compilation that comes from Facebook, and you can see that there are 4 major hotspots in Africa where Facebook is utilized a lot. Southern Africa, particularly South Africa, East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and along the coast of North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, where the Facebook revolution started back in 2010. So what it means is if you're wanting to reach African consumers, these are the kinds of places that you need to be targeting. What it also means is that Africans are no longer blind to what's going on in their own countries. They've now got satellite television, they've got Facebook, they've got news sites, they've got CNN, they've got all of that sort of thing, and they can actually see what's happening in their own countries. It makes it a lot harder for people like Idi Amin, Mobutu Sese Seko, etc., to have the kind of power that they had in the 1960s over their own people. So a real change taking place there. So as all of this change is taking place, of course, the Chindians, the Chinese and the Indians, the Australians, the Canadians, so many others that are operating in the space are investing more and more in Africa. And as that investment happens, it continues to drive that cycle I spoke about. But of course, they're not the only ones doing it. The Belgians, the French, the British, the Americans, the Germans, who have been playing on this continent for a long time, continue to do so and will continue to do so over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Africa's a long-term game. Don't miss out, because otherwise you'll be wondering how the Chinese and the Indians managed to take the whole continent without us looking. Of course, in order for us to take advantage of the rest of the continent, we need to feel comfortable in ourselves. And unfortunately, South Africa is in a relatively difficult place at the moment. We're sitting in 2016 with a couple of challenges. Particularly, we have an election year on our hands. And so with an election year, we always have an incredible amount of noise that takes place around what is essentially something of a political circus. It's a very noisy, very robust political system that we have. And that's going to continue. Certainly within 2016, as these local government elections take place, we're going to have a lot more rhetoric, a lot more unpleasant things are going to be said, and it's going to feel uncomfortable. But in 2017, it will have passed, and it will be passed at least until 2019, when we then have national elections. And our political circus is likely to go round and round and stay with us for a number of years to come. We just got to get used to it and not get distracted by the noise. The other thing that's happening to us, of course, is the economy is in a tough place at the moment. We've got inflation. Brad showed you some of those numbers. We've got the prospect of rising interest rates. We've got a possible ratings downgrade. Let's hope that our finance minister on his roadshow through Europe and the US is going to be able to have some impact on that. We've got a weak rand at the moment. I agree that the rand is probably weaker than it should be based on fundamentals and is likely to come back, but it's still going to be weak, which is bad if you're trying to import product, but good if you're trying to export product. There's low growth. We're sitting at very low growth. And of course, all of this is leading to unrest. We're seeing the unrest on the student campuses. We're seeing and will continue to see labor unrest throughout the country. So 2016 is going to be a difficult year. I think, though, that there are two major things that are likely to help us get out of that difficulty in a way that would be far more difficult for countries that are less prepared than we are. And the first point is that over the last 10 years or so, we have done a tremendous amount of work on our infrastructure. And I know that a lot of South Africans tend to look at this and go, what on earth are you talking about? Our roads are full of potholes, etc. But actually, we have done an incredible amount of work on our infrastructure in terms of our train systems, our road systems, our airports, our harbors that have been widened and dug out, talk of taking the second Durban or taking the old Durban airport and making it into a second port. So there's a lot of focus on infrastructure. And what it means is that as the global economy comes back, as the South African economy starts to come back off the back of that, we will be in a position to pick ourselves up again far better than if we hadn't put the work into infrastructure than we have over the last 5, 10 years. And the second point is the youth. And this really is where the difference comes in, is that we have a very, very robust youth. Yes, they've got challenges. They've got a lot of problems. but they're increasingly urban. As I said, 60% urban already as South Africans, increasingly much more savvy because they live in the cities than being out in areas far away from where most of the activity takes place. They're increasingly outspoken, which is something that comes with urbanism. So, for example, if you look at Zimbabwe, Mugabe does not have support in the cities because the people who live in the cities are increasingly outspoken and they don't go with the kind of ideas that Mugabe puts out there. So being an urbanized population, being outspoken, the youth are far more non-racial. They're much less aware of the racial differences between all of us than we were ourselves at that age. They're far more socially aware than any of us were, in that they understand that there are people that have and people that have not, and tremendous numbers of them are wanting to do something to change that. They're increasingly middle class, so living in cities, it gives them the opportunity to move themselves into the middle class. And because of the challenges of that consolidation that I spoke earlier, they're also increasingly entrepreneurial. And we need a nation of entrepreneurs to drive this economy forward. So I really believe that it's the youth of today who will be the leaders 10, 15, 20 years from now who will also help us to continue to be a successful nation. And I want to end off with a brief video which will give you an idea of why we really shouldn't make assumptions about the youth. So let's have a listen here.
I followed you across the dunes, my love. From the market in Marrakesh, through a sand and concrete wasteland. So when I finally found you, I would dare to ask the question I had carried with me all those miles.
Hey, man! The stuff is so lekker! Where'd you buy it?
New Peri Peri Spice by Nando's.
So I come from Cape Town. So I'm allowed to show a video like that. It's also one of the things that I enjoy about South Africa, that we can do stuff like that and get away with it. I hope I've given you some information that's useful, that you can apply to your own industry and take it back into your own business. And I wish you the best of luck and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Guy. I think you will really agree that we do have speakers of note. Thank you very much for that. And you'll hear a lot more of them during our panel discussion. Great to see some, and I recognize some familiar faces here today. My friend Louis Hendrik as well. Nice to see you with clothes on. It's very nice. Yeah, he's been with Standard Bank a couple of years, and he's today with his bank manager here. And his wife is so impressed with him the last 2 years, just having a look at his bank states. And then she recognized that he is spending a lot of money on